Hey guys, what's going on? It's Preston from the Legendarium. How's everybody doing today? Or this afternoon? Or this evening? Whenever you're listening to this podcast, thank you for listening. This is our 8th episode today, and today we are interviewing zombie author E. Isherwood. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the next 30 minutes with E. Isherwood. Welcome, everybody, to this episode of 30-Minute Author Interviews. Thank you, E. Isherwood, for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me, Preston.
For those that don't know anything about you, why don't you tell them who you are and what you do?
Well, I am a brand new author. I put my first book out in December of 2015. It was a zombie book. I should mention that I'm in my mid-40s. I've never written anything before. I've had a career in IT, which ended, and I just decided that I wanted to be a writer because it was far more interesting and far more creative. So while I was unemployed, I didn't really think that I mean, we can dream, right, about being a full-time author, but at the time, I just really wanted to write my books. So that was the impetus for becoming an author. And lo and behold, as the year has gone on, I've been able to sell enough books that I may not have to go back to IT.
That's awesome, especially for a new author. That's really good. So what made you, or when did you really get interested in writing then, since you hadn't really written before?
Well, I will share the story that's kind of it's in the paperwork from my website and in my books. But my grandmother passed away in 2014, and she was 104.
Wow.
So, and she's got a big family, and she's kind of the center of all our gatherings for many, many years. And at her funeral, I thought, I mean, I'm not eloquent or anything like that I could speak about her, but I thought it would be kind of cool to write a little short story about a woman who was very much like my grandma and put her in a zombie story. So the first short story that I wrote was, about 6,000 words, and it was about this old woman who lived with her live-in nurse, and the nurse got infected, and then she had to do a series of escapes to get away from her and eventually neutralize her. But I liked writing it so much that I kept going, and that short story more or less became chapter 1 of book 1. And then really I guess it was the fall of 2014, I did the National Novel Writing Month. And that's when I first sort of really applied myself to write a book. Which, for anyone who doesn't know, is a kind of a contest. I mean, I use the term loosely, but you have a month to write a novel, and you're with, I don't know how many other thousands of people doing this, and it's to encourage each other to, to sit down every night and just write.
So did you actually finish your story in that month?
Yeah, I think I did.
How many words did you end up having to write per day in order to get that done?
I believe it was 3,000 words a day.
Okay, wow.
I think it ended up the finish line, if you will, is 50,000 words, and the book as it is now is 90,000 words. And I'm pretty sure. I mean, I've done a lot since then, so it's hard to remember the timeline, but I'm pretty sure it was pretty close to how it was the final version. Now, it wasn't edited or anything, and that's the point, is just to sit down and just crank, to get experience in, the craft of writing an entire novel.
Gotcha. Do you plan on doing that again this year?
I don't know. I mean, I certainly could. I wouldn't. I mean, I don't have any doubt that I could to write a book in that amount of time. It's just that with everything else I got going on, I don't know that I will have the time to do that, frankly.
Right. So why zombie books?
That's an interesting question, and one I should know off the tip of my tongue. I guess the easy answer is because I liked reading zombie books. I've always enjoyed kind of the post-apocalyptic, Stephen King's The Stand and Lucifer's Hammer, those kinds of end of the world books and movies.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, zombies just to me it adds a level of tension that maybe because I'm not really an experienced writer yet, that I haven't been, I don't know that I could write a EMP end of the world type of a book yet. But I'm very familiar with zombies and zombie literature, and I've delved into several authors' catalogs, so I kind of knew the structure, I guess.
No, okay. Did you ever try to get your series to a publisher, or have you just decided to go indie with it the whole way?
When I first started out, actually, I wrote the first one in 2014, and I was still employed at the time, and I wrote the next two in 2015, and honestly, I wrote them for myself. I never intended to publish them. I secretly hoped to publish them, but at the time all I wanted to do was prove to myself that I could write a series of books, and at the time it was going to be a trilogy. But when I put them out as I said, in January 2015, and they didn't just take off. I mean, there was a long time when they didn't do much of anything, but I would look at the Amazon numbers and think, oh, you know what? 2 people bought my book today, but I know it's not perfectly edited. I didn't have an editor. I know that the cover's not as good as it can be. And that's when I realized, if you're going to be on Amazon, you really have to respect that people are putting their money, on your books. And so you really, at that point, I really kind of took a second look, and I went back and made an effort to really re-edit the books, the first one anyway, which was kind of the more rough cut. And I could tell as the reviews started coming in that they weren't complaining about the editing and all that. So that made me feel like I was given a pretty good product.
So for those that don't know, why don't you tell them what your zombie series is called and kind of give them a book blurb of what it's about?
Sure. The series is called The Sirens of the Zombie Apocalypse, and the first book is called Since the Sirens. And as I said, it's the main character is a 104-year-old elderly woman she's in pretty good shape. My grandmother was kind of the archetype for her, and she could walk around, and she was very very with it right up until the end. So this woman is very similar. The only difference is I gave her a 15-year-old boy named Liam, her great-grandson. And he gets put in her house by his parents because, they weren't getting along. So he has to spend the summer with his great-grandma, which, he's a techie, plays video games online with his friends all the time. And to be sort of relegated to the city with his great-grandmother, that's just not cool. But when the zombies come, things obviously change, and the book is an escape for them, but it's also kind of an exploration of Liam and how he interacts with a woman who he originally doesn't want to be around, but he learns a few things from her.
So how many books will end up being in the series?
That's a good question. I don't know how many there will be. Right now I have 5 published, and book number 6 comes out in September. And I guess the honest answer is I would love to just keep writing these as long as people are interested in the story. If I became bored with it, I think it would certainly show. It's one thing I've learned about being a writer is, you just can't phone it in. People are gonna notice. So how many books? I have 9 sketched out, but it could easily increase. And I also have a series that's set 100 years beyond this book, because a lot of my interest in post-apocalyptic fiction is, what are the actions of people at the cusp of the disaster? How does that affect people who live, way down the line?
What do you feel is one of the most difficult things that you come across while you're writing, and then how do you overcome that?
I would say that the most difficult part of writing is sitting down to write every day. And, I cast myself as a full-time writer, and it's what I want to do. I love sitting and getting lost in the world that I'm creating. But, life has so many things that it throws at you. I've got a couple of kids this summer. My 2 kids, I'm not complaining, that, they're home for the summer, and my wife is working, so they're around, and you feel like a bad parent if they're here, but you're not interacting with them. So there's that, and, other things come into play. But the most difficult thing for me is just to sit down, and, I'm blessed that I'm able to write pretty quickly, but finding the time to do it, even as a full-time writer, is surprisingly difficult.
Gotcha. So since you write zombie books, are your books more YA kind of zombie books, or are they more adult, I don't want to say adult themed, are they aimed more at adults, or are they kind of aimed more at the YA group?
I don't market it as YA, even though the characters, the boy is 15, and I will give away that he meets a girl. She's 17. And, some of the reviewers have mentioned that it kind of has a YA feel to it. Others have said that it just reminds them of kind of a family. It's more, I don't even know what the genre would be, but, it's just a story about a family that's trying to survive. There's not love themes or anything like that, which you might get in sort of a young adult book. And it's not really coming of age, but these kids are growing up in this larger disaster. I will say that, the reviewers have noted, and I kind of designed it this way, that it's not, I would rate it as PG-13. I intentionally did not, put a lot of cussing in it, and it doesn't have any of the, major, cuss words or anything like that, just because, I kind of felt like the woman, the matriarch, she's a lot like my grandmother, and she didn't cuss, and she's kind of religious and this and that. So, it just felt like, it just came naturally that it's more reserved in that regard.
When you're doing research for your books, if someone was to go behind you and look at your browser history, what's maybe the weirdest thing you've had to look up that someone could find on your browser history?
I don't know. It's going to sound totally boring, but I was looking at railroad coal car gondolas.
Mm-hmm.
The characters spend some time running across a moving train, and I wondered to myself, is it even possible if the coal car is empty to get in and out? I mean, that sounds completely boring, but there's a lot more interesting things in the book. I guess that it's set in St. Louis, which is where I live. So a lot of it really flowed for me because I knew the areas that I was talking about. So maybe I have a little less research than somebody who, if I had written it set in somewhere in No Name, Virginia, for example.
Have you ever written any of your characters into a situation you weren't sure how to get them out of, so you kind of had to just stop and figure it out?
Well, yeah, a good friend of mine said that being a writer is about putting your characters up in a tree and throwing rocks at them, which I found it to be true. And, with zombies, I let my characters go where they want to go most of the time, and sometimes they take me to places where I just think, I just need magic or something to get them out of there because there's just no way to do it, no other way to do it. But part of being a writer is just being creative and figuring out the one little crack in the armor that people might not have noticed.
So growing up, did you read a lot, or were you kind of a non-reader when you were growing up?
Yes, I read. I don't know when I started to read, but I remember in my teenage years I read a lot. And I think I've already mentioned Stephen King's The Stand. That was probably, I read that in college, and that was probably the first, sort of the most prominent book that I can distinctly remember reading and being anxious to get back to the book. I mean, it's a huge book, as I'm sure most readers know. So I think it probably took me a week to read through it back then, but it was so much fun to it was like Christmas every day going back to it. So I think that had a lot to do with, my later years of reading that type of fiction. And then, of course, hopefully doing justice to the post-apocalyptic genre by writing in there.
So is that book one that you can just read over and over and never get tired of, or is there any other books that you just can't get enough of and you love to read multiple times?
Well, the problem with The Stand is it's so long. You really just gotta, I mean, especially nowadays, as a writer, I have very little time to read. I think I've read 4 books in the last year probably. And I used to read, a book a week because I loved it. But yeah, I think if I had to keep going back to one book that I really enjoy, it's a book called Earth Abides by George Stewart. It was written in the '50s or late '40s, I believe, and Stephen King actually mentioned it, I'm pretty sure, as sort of the inspiration for his book, The Stand, because I don't know if it's one of the earliest plague books where humanity's wiped out, and the characters in the book, I think it spans 50 or 60 years. So it really speaks to me as far as seeing the disaster up close, but then also taking a broader view and seeing how the things that people do right at the cusp of the disaster can have huge implications farther down the line.
If you could write in any author's world, whether it's an indie author or a published author, which world would you like to write in and why?
Well, being a zombie author, one of my favorite zombie writers is Mark Tufo. He's got a series of books called Zombie Fallout, which if I could write in anyone, I think that I would like to write in his world, just because he's been such an inspiration as far as honing the craft of writing zombie books.
And so your author name is E.E. Isherwood, and obviously that's a pen name. Is there a special meaning to the pen name, or where did it come from?
Yeah, it's almost like we planned this interview to the T, because E.E. The letters are the first initials of both of my grandfathers. And Isherwood is the first name of the main character of the book I just mentioned, which is Earth Abides. And I chose that obviously because it has importance to me. I really was inspired by that book, and obviously I've written about sort of family lines, and that's why I thought it was kind of cool to include both of my grandfathers.
That's actually pretty neat. You wrote an article on Sarah Noffke's website called Play for the Win. For those that haven't read it, could you tell us some of the lessons you have learned so far in your writing career?
Well, I think the most important lesson is that you have to acknowledge your audience. And I mentioned this before when I put my books on Amazon. It wasn't just for me and my mom to read. These are real people out there who are spending real dollars to see what your imagination has conjured up. And, if you don't respect that, and you just put out garbage and expect people to pay for it, it's really insulting, but B, I mean, it's just super unprofessional. And so I think that what I've learned really quick at the beginning was, put your best effort into your writing, but also into the marketing of your books, to make the editing perfect. Well, I use the word perfect loosely. I mean, not everybody can afford, let's be realistic here. Not everybody can afford $1,000 in editing work, but, certainly most of my books I paid for a proofreader. So they weren't looking to change the plot or anything like that, like more of a serious editor might do, but they were making sure that, there was no misspelled words and the punctuation is correct, which, taken together, is an important factor in making your book presentable to readers. And I think another corollary of that is listening to readers. I mean, I know some authors don't like to read reviews, but I think they're pretty important. Some of them anyway. Some of them are just weird, but but the ones that hurt the most, I think, are the ones that have truth to them. And some of the reviews that I've gotten and they don't even have to be totally negative, but they'll point out little flaws here and there which you may not have noticed because you spend so much time with the material.
And you have another book series out there called Revolutions Per Mile. Can you tell us where that idea came from and kind of the book blurb about what that series is about?
Well, you may not know this, but I like to write in the post-apocalyptic world. And one of literally my favorite movie from 2015 was Mad Max Fury Road, which, have you seen that movie?
I haven't.
Okay, you have to see it. I mean, it's craziness on wheels in this post-apocalyptic disaster world, and it's a masterpiece of world building. I mean, the story is dead simple. It's just driving from point A to point B, but the world building is just beautiful. So that inspired me. Obviously I can't write in that particular world, but I wanted to write a book involving fast cars. And it just so happens to be these teen girls that are put in after a nuclear war. They're out in the western parts of Kansas, and they have to deliver freight in this hostile environment, and so they have to use these fast cars, which are left over, from a bygone world. And it's set a few years after a limited nuclear skirmish. So it kind of has an early Mad Max feel, like the first Mad Max. But it was just fun to write, and literally I wrote them because it just made me happy.
So you have 2 of those out. Do you plan on doing any more, or is that series done?
I do plan on doing more. I've got several ideas in my head. It's just I'm really trying to stay focused on my zombie books, because that's frankly where my marketing is right now. Mm-hmm. But I have to get back to those books because I want to see where I can take it, but I just love writing in that world.
So, for the crazy question, do you have any non-zombie story ideas or non-post-apocalyptic ideas?
Yes, I in addition to the sort of post-apocalyptic whatever you want to call it, I also enjoy sci-fi. A lot of my reading has been in science fiction, and so I don't know, I would like to write something in sci-fi, kind of to broaden the audience. But I don't have anything drawn up to where I could just sit down and crank something out.
Gotcha. On your bio on Amazon, it mentions how Dungeons and Dragons helped with your imagination. Have you been able to apply any of those stories you might have come up with for Dungeons and Dragons into your stories?
The stories echo. I sometimes I'll see a situation in a book that I'm writing, and I think, oh, you know what? This is just like 1984, when I was, in this particular dungeon, we were doing this particular thing, and something, something jumped out of the closet or whatever. But I guess the broader question is to go back a step. Another thing that I would like to write about is fantasy, because I grew up on playing Dungeons and Dragons, which is obviously fantasy. But it's a matter of there's only so much time to do writing, and I at this point I don't have anything sketched out. But I think it would be cool to write, I'm sure it's been done to death, but a modern interpretation of how I look back on those days playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Is there a certain type of scene for you when you're writing that's just a little bit harder for you to write than other kind of scenes?
The short answer is no. I will tell you that the easiest scenes for me to write are when the zombies are literally around the corner and they're preparing, to defend themselves, or they have to run. I could crank out several thousand words in an hour if that's all it was, to writing a zombie book. But there has to be breaks in the action. The people have to talk to each other. You have to give these people characterizations and backstories, which, you dabble in from time to time. So I would say that, I don't find any of it hard, but I find a lot of it very easy.
Gotcha. What's your least favorite process or what's your least favorite part of the publishing or writing process?
I really don't like making print books. It's something that I do myself. I do everything myself, except for design the covers. But to take all of your words and format it into a book and fight the dangling participles or whatever, the hanging chads. I forget what you call it, but the sentences have to end at a certain point on each page, and so you can spend several hours looking at those, and it's not very fun. So that's probably the least favorite thing.
Gotcha. I hadn't even thought of that before. That's actually the first time I've gotten that answer. So here at the Legendarium, we like to end on a segment that we call the Legendary Ending. So we're just going to jump into it, and, these are just kind of little rapid-fire questions, so whatever the first thing is that pops in your mind, just blurt it on out. The first question is, what songs are currently on your writing playlist?
I've got a playlist that's 12 hours long, and it's on Spotify, and I just cycle it through week in and week out. So the last group that I can remember, I don't even know the song, but the last group I can remember is probably Fantagram.
Okay. What type of music is that?
I believe it's shoegaze. Look it up.
I've never heard of it.
It's like a sort of electronic dance, sort of.
Okay. If you were stuck in a zombie apocalypse with one of your characters that you've created, which one would you want to be stuck with?
If it was a character I created, then I would probably want to be with Liam. He's a cool cat.
And if you could pick a character from any media source, comics, books, movies, video games, whatever, which character would you want to be stuck with?
I would hang with Gandalf, the White, by the way.
Why Gandalf the White?
He'd be handy to have in a fix, and he's got a cool accent.
If you had a time machine, where would you travel and why?
I would say, now hang with me on this. I would want to go to see Adam and Eve take the apple from the devil. Now, the reason I say that, I'm not particularly religious, but I think that if the time machine was able to take me there, it would tell me just tons about human history. But if it said, destination not found, that would also tell me something pretty important.
Right. If you had to pick one genre to read for the rest of your life, which would you pick and why?
The rest of my life.
Yep.
I think I would still go with post-apocalyptic fiction, because a lot of it is, how to survive, how to improve the human condition, even if it's zombies or EMPs or nuclear war. I think that most of it, at least that I read, has a very positive message about humanity.
And if you had to pick either Marvel or DC for the rest of your comic, movies, and television entertainment, which do you choose?
Wow. Marvel is Iron Man and the Hulk and all that, right?
Correct.
My wife watches those movies over and over, which you would think that would get me to not pick Marvel, but I don't know. I kind of like them. And Superman's one of my least favorites, so I'm going to go with Marvel.
Oh. Why Superman one of your least favorites?
I just don't like somebody who's got all the answers. Sure, he's got his kryptonite and all that, but he can turn the world around and go back in time. I just don't buy it. It's too much.
Gotcha. So a penguin walks through the door right now wearing a sombrero. What does he say and why is he here?
Oh, he's here looking for me to say something funny, but I tell him that you'll have to come back in 5 minutes because that's how long it takes me to think of something funny.
Sounds good. Before we leave, do you have any kind of advice, whether it be for writing or life, that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Wow, that's pretty heavy for a zombie author, I mean, if you had self-help people, I mean, that'd be one thing. I think the best advice anybody ever gave me was just to show up. So much of life is just showing up and doing a job or being a good friend or whatever, or in this case, writing a book. If you just show up every day and put in the time, you can make an honest effort at being a good writer.
Sounds good. Where can our listeners go if they want to find out more about you or your books?
I make it as difficult as possible. I don't have an online presence. No, obviously, Amazon. That's 99% of where I am as far as sales go. But my website is zombiebooks.net.
Sounds good. Well, we will put links to your Amazon page and your zombiesbooks.net. We'll put links to those down in the bottom. And thank you for joining us today for this episode of 30-Minute Author Interviews.
Thanks, Preston. It was fun.
It was. Well, guys, that is all the time we have got for this week's episode of 30-Minute Author Interviews. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to it. If you enjoyed this episode or any past episodes, head on over to legendarium.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast on several platforms: iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, TuneIn, and even by your email. And if you would, please take time and rate and review the podcast. It would really help us out. And until next time, guys, have a good one and stay legendary. Oh, screwed that up. Oh well, there's always next week.